Paradoxes. There are tons of it in the world. Grandfather paradox, bootstrap paradox, Pinocchio paradox. I'm telling you, there are a lot. Even in history, you can see these things appear, and in ways that will make you think. Or maybe just me. If it's apparently just me, this video will make you think how ironic some things in our history were. The unsinkable one. The Titanic set out from Southampton in April 1912, with a band playing and newspapers calling it a floating palace. The ship had 4 smokestacks, though one was just there to look cool. It had watertight compartments, electric elevators, fancy restaurants, and enough hype to make everyone feel like Poseidon himself stamped the blueprint. Engineers swore it could stay afloat even with serious damage. Someone even said it was practically unsinkable, which is just tempting fate in the dumbest way possible. The lifeboats? They were more about appearances than actual safety. There were only 20 for over 2,000 people, because after all, why would you need more than that if the idea of your ship is to be unsinkable, right? Kinda defeats the purpose of the advertisement. A few days into the voyage, wireless operators on the Titanic started getting iceberg warnings. They ignored most of them, since the ship was on a tight schedule and Captain Smith wasn't about to be late on what was supposed to be his retirement cruise. He wanted to go out with a bang, figuratively, not literally, but oops. On the night of the 14th of April, the lookout spotted an iceberg dead ahead. The crew turned the wheel and cut the engines, which slowed the ship just enough to let the iceberg rip open the starboard side like a can opener. The iceberg gashed several compartments. The problem was, Titanic could stay afloat with 4 flooded sections, but not 5. Water poured in, each compartment spilling into the next, like a really bleak Rube Goldberg machine. As the front dipped lower, the back started rising out of the water. By 2:20 a.m., the entire ship broke apart and sank. Over 1,500 people died, some drowned. Others froze in the Atlantic while the lifeboats floated nearby, mostly half full, because nobody wanted to risk getting swamped. Newspapers flipped out the next day. The ship that bragged about how it couldn't go down had just gone down in the most dramatic fashion possible. Engineers had to admit that steel, rivets, and press releases don't really hold up when you smash into a giant chunk of ice at high speed. Then came the investigations. British and American inquiries tore into the design, the lack of lifeboats, the speed, the captain's choices, and the shipbuilder's overconfidence. Turns out, when you cut safety corners to make room for squash courts and cigar rooms, disaster gets a VIP pass. The anti-slavery slave owner. In 1787, Thomas Jefferson drafted the Northwest Ordinance, a law that barred slavery from any new territory north of the Ohio River. That law would go on to shape America's geographic divide over slavery. Northern territories couldn't adopt it, southern ones could. It laid a clear line, and it made Jefferson look like someone who was at least trying to put a lid on slavery. Now just wait a cotton-picking minute. Before that, T-Jeff still had that, "You're funny, I'm buying you" attitude while having dozens of them in chains back at Monticello. Jefferson's personal plantation relied heavily on enslaved labor. He tracked their productivity like livestock, noted their ages and skills in ledgers, and kept detailed records of the profits they brought in. He even multiplied them slaves organically to save money on purchasing freshly caught ones. Meanwhile, on paper, he helped draft a policy that blocked the expansion of slavery, just not in places where his wallet might feel it. He was fine with stopping slavery where he had no land, no investment, no stake, but the place where he actually lived, that was off limits. The enslaved people there were his property. They were part of his wealth, part of his social standing, part of his identity. He wasn't giving that up. The Northwest Ordinance was seen as progressive by many at the time, and some historians still treat it as proof Jefferson wanted slavery to die out slowly, but nothing in his actions at Monticello supports that theory. He never freed most of his slaves, even in death. He never pushed for abolition in Virginia, where he had influence. He never called out his fellow landowners. He did the opposite. He defended slavery as a necessary evil, a problem that would have to fix itself sometime in the future, just not now, not during his lifetime, and definitely not at the cost of his lifestyle. This is where the hypocrisy gets hard to ignore. Jefferson wasn't trapped by the system, he was the system. He designed parts of it, profited from it, and maintained it. When it came time to choose between his principles and his plantation, the choice was easy. He went with the land, the profits, and the silence. And yet, he got to carry the reputation of a progressive thinker, a founder who wrestled with big moral questions. He got the credit for banning slavery in new lands without ever having to face the contradiction that his own life screamed out loud. The Great War. This war was so great you wouldn't need another one, and there goes another one because some guy with toothbrush bristles above his lip threw a hissy fit. In 1914, Europe threw itself into a war nobody thought would take 4 years or swallow millions of lives. H.G. Wells gave it a shiny label early on, calling it the war that will end war, which sounded noble until everyone realized that statement aged like milk. Countries went in thinking it'd be over by Christmas, marching with brass bands and national pride, but instead they got mud, machine guns, gas, and body counts that spiraled into the millions. By 1918, the landscape was a shredded mess, both physically and politically. Entire empires, Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, were either gone or crumbling, and everyone was too tired to celebrate anything. When the dust settled, the Treaty of Versailles showed up pretending to be a solution. Germany got slapped with war guilt, insane reparations, and territorial losses that humiliated them into a corner. The Allied powers, especially France and Britain, wanted payback more than peace, and the treaty was less of a blueprint for stability and more of a warning label nobody read. Instead of repairing Europe, it just left Germany pissed off and broke. A dozen new countries were slapped together across Eastern Europe with messy borders, shaky governments, and zero clue how to keep it all together. Meanwhile, the US ran back across the Atlantic like it had touched a hot stove. Woodrow Wilson showed up with his 14 points and dreams of a League of Nations, then went home and couldn't even get Congress to join it. Without the US, the League was like a security guard with no arms, no legs, and no phone. Japan and Italy, technically on the winning side, walked away annoyed that they didn't get enough loot. Russia, now run by Bolsheviks, got treated like a disease and left out entirely. The 1920s looked kind of stable on the surface, but it was a drunken calm. Economies bounced between chaos and growth, dictators started crawling out of the woodwork, and Germany was doing financial gymnastics just to keep from imploding. Then came the Great Depression in 1929, and the bottom fell out. Unemployment, inflation, starvation, Germany got hit hardest. Remember that guy with toothbrush bristles above his lip throwing a hissy fit? Yeah, it's time. He promised jobs, revenge, and an end to the humiliation. A lot of people shrugged and went along with it because honestly, they were out of options and out of patience. So by 1939, Germany blitzed into Poland and World War II officially kicked off. All that death and misery from 1914 to 1918 didn't scare anyone off. It just set the stage for a great war greater than the Great War that everyone initially thought was already great. We wouldn't have a greater war, but there it was. Well, that was long. On to the next bit. Socratic paradox. Socrates wandered the streets of Athens, asking questions that made grown men squirm. He'd corner people in the marketplace and ask them what justice was or what courage meant. Most would start with some long-winded answer. Socrates would poke holes in it until the poor guy was standing there realizing he had no clue what he was talking about. Socrates did this over and over, not because he wanted to feel smarter, but because he had figured out that the more questions you ask, the more you see how little you know. Now, here's where it gets funny. The oracle at Delphi, this lady who spoke for the gods, declared that Socrates was the wisest man in Athens. Socrates heard this and thought it had to be some kind of mistake. So he went around trying to find someone wiser. Politicians, full of themselves. Poets, couldn't explain their own work. Craftsmen, knew their trade but thought that made them experts on everything else. After grilling all of them, Socrates realized the oracle had a point. Everyone else thought they knew things they clearly didn't. Socrates, on the other hand, understood that he didn't know much of anything. The more he examined life and knowledge, the clearer it became that certainty is a trap. People cling to half-baked ideas to avoid facing the gaps in their understanding. Socrates just didn't play that game. He was perfectly fine saying, "I don't know." This honesty about his ignorance actually made him the wisest person around. This little truth annoyed a lot of people. No one likes being told they don't know what they're talking about, especially not by some scruffy philosopher in public. But Socrates wasn't out to embarrass people. He believed the examined life was the only one worth living, and that meant questioning everything, especially your own beliefs. He showed that wisdom isn't about having all the answers. It's about knowing the limits of what you understand and being ready to learn more. Famous last words. But this one is not that song by My Chemical Romance. In 1864, during the messy hellstorm of the American Civil War, Union General John Sedgwick made history for one truly dumb reason. It was at the Battle of Spotsylvania, where Confederate sharpshooters were peppering his soldiers. Sedgwick, annoyed as hell by his troops ducking and dodging like a bunch of scared little kids, decided it was the perfect moment to loudly declare they couldn't hit an elephant at this distance. Smart, real smart, Johnny. The universe apparently thought it was hilarious to prove him wrong instantly, so moments after he tossed out that gem of reassurance, a sniper bullet went straight through his head, and the general dropped dead right there. Nobody planned on the poor dude becoming a literal poster boy for ironic failure, but he managed it spectacularly. Sedgwick was known for bravery and leadership, basically the guy everyone thought would survive anything. Instead, he became famous for making a prediction so ridiculously wrong that even Confederate soldiers probably cracked up over the irony. The exact opposite of his confident words unfolded immediately, mocking the general's final seconds. His troops, who had just been scolded for dodging bullets, now stood around staring at their dead leader. To be free means to be broke. Kinda like how when teenagers who want to move out because they couldn't stand their parents, so they move out, but at the cost of being broke and homeless. Same went with Haiti. In 1804, the country kicked out the French after a brutal slave revolt and became the first black republic. France lost its prized colony, along with all the wealth it was squeezing from sugar plantations run on enslaved labor. France wasn't thrilled, so they cut diplomatic ties and threatened to blockade the new country. For about 2 decades, Haiti was stuck in limbo, isolated from global trade, and constantly watching for a French warship to show up on the horizon. The country badly needed official recognition to trade openly and avoid future attacks. In 1825, the French king, Charles X, came up with a deal. If Haiti wanted recognition, it would have to pay France 150 million francs. It was compensation to former French slaveholders for their so-called property losses. Ironically, that property was the same people that they enslaved and won their freedom. In other words, Haitians were being forced to pay for the fact that they had freed themselves. And the price tag was outrageous. At the time, Haiti's entire national budget was a tiny fraction of that amount. French warships sailed into Haitian waters to make sure no one said no. Faced with the threat of invasion, Haitian President Jean-Pierre Boyer signed the agreement. Now the country had to come up with an impossible amount of money or risk war. The Haitian government started borrowing from French banks at high interest just to make the first payments. So now it owed not only France but also European bankers, with interest piling up fast. To raise money, Haiti slapped crushing taxes on its people and increased exports of coffee and sugar. The government squeezed the agricultural economy dry to meet the debt payments. Infrastructure projects were shelved, schools were neglected, and public services barely functioned. Almost every bit of national revenue was funneled into paying off the debt. The cycle kept going for generations. Haitians who weren't even alive during the revolution were still working to pay back this so-called indemnity. Prohibition. In 1920, the United States government passed the Volstead Act to enforce the 18th Amendment, which banned the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol. The thinking was simple. Take away alcohol, and you'll get rid of drunkenness, crime, and all the social headaches that came with it. That logic aged about as well as milk on a sunny day. Almost immediately, Americans found creative ways to keep drinking. People made their own booze at home, called bathtub gin, which tasted about as terrible as the name suggests, but still got the job done. Doctors began writing bogus prescriptions for medicinal whiskey. Religious loopholes allowed wine consumption for communion, and suddenly everyone felt very spiritual. On top of that, speakeasies, illegal bars, popped up like weeds in every major city. By the mid-1920s, there were more of these secret clubs than there had ever been legal saloons before the ban. While regular people were figuring out how to sneak a drink, organized crime groups noticed a golden opportunity. With alcohol illegal, the demand for it skyrocketed. Criminal outfits jumped in to meet that demand, running massive bootlegging operations. Smuggling liquor became big business, and gangs quickly got rich in violent fighting over territory and supply chains. Figures like Al Capone in Chicago made millions, using bribery and muscle to keep operations running smoothly. Politicians and law enforcement weren't immune either. Corruption spread like wildfire. Bribes kept the cops looking the other way, and in some cases, they even joined in the racket themselves. The more authorities tried to clamp down, the worse things got. The government sent in prohibition agents, but many were underpaid, untrained, and easily bought off. Raids did happen, but for every distillery shut down, 5 more popped up. Public sentiment started changing. Meanwhile, violent crime surged. Gang wars erupted in cities across the country, and innocent bystanders got caught in the crossfire. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, where 7 men died in a Chicago garage, became a national symbol of just how out of hand things had become. The government was losing control, and the public knew it. By the early 1930s, the Great Depression hit, and the idea of missing out on potential tax revenue from alcohol started to sting. People were also sick of the violence and corruption linked to prohibition. In 1933, the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th, bringing the whole experiment to an end. Legal alcohol returned, and with it, a chunk of the underworld's cash flow dried up. But the criminal networks that prohibition helped build didn't just pack up and go home. When the cat's away, the mice will play. In the 1230s, Pope Gregory IX decided cats were basically demons in fursuits. He issued a papal bull called Vox in Rama, which, among other wild claims, accused black cats of being linked to devil worship. People across Europe, already neck-deep in superstition, took this as their cue to go on a cat-killing spree. They didn't exactly pause to ask if the cats were actually guilty of anything, they just rounded them up and whip to their next lives they go. Monks, nobles, peasants, everyone jumped in on the fun. The fewer cats they saw prowling around towns and farms, the holier they thought they were. Now, this was medieval Europe. Sanitation was not a thing, and rodents were a constant headache. Before this feline purge, cats kept the rat population somewhat in check. Once cats became public enemy number one, rats had a field day. They bred uncontrollably and moved into every corner of cities and villages. No one seemed to notice or care at first. They were too busy patting themselves on the back for fighting Satan's furry minions. Fast forward about a century, the mid-1300s rolled around, and with it came one of the nastiest pandemics in human history, the Black Death. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible, didn't travel on its own. It hitched rides on fleas that infested rats. Thanks to the earlier mass slaughter of cats, the rat population had ballooned in many areas of Europe, giving the disease a perfect highway to spread. Flea-ridden rats invaded homes, markets, and even churches. People fell sick in droves, and the plague tore through Europe like wildfire, killing tens of millions. Of course, no one at the time connected their war on cats with the surge in rats and the plague's spread. They just kept blaming outsiders, bad air, or divine punishment. The church never officially reversed its stance on cats, but by the time the worst of the Black Death was over, some communities had quietly gone back to letting cats do their job. It turns out that living with a few supposed devils was better than letting the rats run the place. Still, the damage had already been done. Entire generations were wiped out, and Europe took centuries to recover. And all this kicked off because one pope thought cats were hanging out with the devil. Life is a highway, except you won't want to ride this one all night long. James Dean shot to fame in the early 1950s. He had a thing for speed, cars, and rebellion, and the studios loved packaging him as the cool, brooding heartthrob. He starred in East of Eden, then Rebel Without a Cause, which pretty much made him the poster boy for teenage angst. The thing is, off-camera, he was basically living that persona, tearing around in fast cars whenever he wasn't on set. By 1955, Dean had already developed a serious obsession with racing. He bought a Porsche 356 Speedster and started competing in amateur races, finishing respectably in several events. While working on Giant, his final film, Warner Brothers, slapped a ban on his racing. The studio didn't want their rising star ending up in a hospital. He wasn't thrilled about it, but went along for a while. The second the movie wrapped, he got himself a Porsche 550 Spider, which he named Little Bastard. Some people might have called him that for being a walking contradiction, but he named his car that just to rub some salt on the wounds of the people that he lives in rent-free. During this same time, Dean got roped into a public service announcement about highway safety. The PSA was short, just a few lines at the end of a television interview. He looked into the camera and said something along the lines of, "Take it easy driving. The life you save might be mine." Not exactly Shakespeare, but the message was clear. Pedal to the metal won't get you a medal or something like that. A week later, on the 30th of September, 1955, Dean planned to drive the new Porsche to a race in Salinas. His mechanic, Rolf Witherich, rode with him. They took off mid-morning, planning to break in the car on the way up. Dean ignored advice to trailer the Porsche and drive it safely up in a support vehicle. He wanted to drive the car himself, on the open road. As they headed north on Route 466, Dean was reportedly speeding through small towns and open stretches. Around 5:45 p.m., near Sholam, California, a Ford Tudor driven by Donald Turnipseed made a left turn across Dean's lane. The Porsche smashed into the side of the Ford at an estimated speed of about 85 miles per hour. Wutherich was thrown from the car and survived with serious injuries. Dean wasn't so lucky. He suffered massive internal injuries and was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the hospital. He was 24. In the aftermath, the PSA he had filmed aired repeatedly, and people latched onto the cruel irony. The guy who had told kids to drive safely had just killed himself driving recklessly. It wasn't hard for the media to press the irony even more. Actually, there are way more ironies in history that are paradoxes of itself. So if you want more, you gotta let me know in the comments. But before I end,